for most of her life. Whoopi Goldberg had no clear answer to one of the simplest questions a person can ask. Where did my family come from? She had no village she could point to, no ancestral homeland passed down through generations, no grandmother's stories about a distant town, no family tree that could take her confidently beyond a certain point. And even the name the world knows her by was never really inherited. She was born Karen Elaine Johnson in 1955. The name Whoopi came later, from a nickname. Goldberg was chosen by her mother, Emma Johnson, who believed that a name like Goldberg might help her daughter navigate the entertainment industry. The name was carefully chosen. Her ancestry was not. For years, Goldberg believed that her family might have Caribbean roots. It wasn't necessarily a firm claim. It was the kind of family story that can survive for generations. Someone remembers an island. Someone remembers something an older relative once said. The details disappear, but the general idea remains. Eventually, the story becomes part of the family, but nobody can prove it. Goldberg was remarkably open about that uncertainty. She never pretended to know something she couldn't verify, and that uncertainty was shared by millions of African Americans whose family histories had been damaged by slavery, displacement, separation, and missing records. Then, in the early 2000s, something became possible that previous generations could never have imagined. DNA testing offered a way to look beyond the historical records, and when Whoopi Goldberg received the results, the story she had carried for years began to change. To understand why those results mattered, we first have to understand why her family history was so difficult to trace in the first place. For many African American families, the trail begins to disappear around the period before emancipation. The 1870 United States Census is an important milestone because it was the first census to record formerly enslaved people by name as part of the general population. Before that, enslaved people were generally recorded in separate slave schedules, but those records were fundamentally different from the records used to build a normal family tree. Names were often missing. Family relationships were rarely documented. Parents and children could be separated. Siblings could be sold away from one another, and surnames could change depending on ownership, location, or circumstances. The result was devastating for genealogy. The people existed, the families existed, the history existed, but the paperwork often did not. Slavery had created a system in which human beings were treated as property, and the records reflected that reality. A person's age might be recorded, their sex might be recorded, their sex might be recorded, their value might be recorded, but the names of their parents, grandparents, and children were often not preserved in a way that could later be followed. This meant that generations after emancipation, family histories could become fragments. A specific ancestor became a state became a region became an island, and an island became a story that everyone remembered but nobody could prove. That is the kind of environment in which Goldberg's Caribbean family story existed. It wasn't necessarily fabricated, it was simply impossible to verify. And then came a new tool. In 2006, Whoopi Goldberg participated in Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s PBS documentary series, African American Lives. The project explored the ancestry of prominent African Americans using genealogy and genetic testing. The goal was simple but incredibly ambitious. Could science recover information that slavery and history had erased from the written record? Goldberg's results provided an answer. Her ancestry did not simply point toward the Caribbean. It pointed back to Africa, and not to one single location. The results showed genetic connections to multiple populations in West and Central Africa. Among the populations identified were the Papal and Bijago peoples associated with the region of present-day Guinea-Bissau. Suddenly, the blank space in Goldberg's family history had a geography. But this wasn't simply a dot appearing on a map. Behind those names were real communities with their own languages, cultures, political systems, and histories. The Bijago in particular developed a reputation for resisting Portuguese attempts to control their islands and coastal territories. Their environment gave them natural advantages. The islands were difficult for outsiders to navigate. The people knew the waterways, they knew the terrain, and European powers attempting to dominate the region often encountered resistance. But the Atlantic slave trade was an enormous system. It connected European merchants, African states, coastal traders, ships, ports, and markets across an ocean. No single community could remain completely untouched by it forever. People from the region were eventually caught up in the trade and transported across the Atlantic. Many were taken toward Brazil and other parts of the Americas. Their descendants would eventually live thousands of miles from the places where their ancestors had been born. And this is where Goldberg's DNA results became more than just percentages. They connected her to specific populations whose histories had been caught up in one of the largest forced migrations in human history. But there is an important distinction. DNA ancestry testing cannot identify a specific ancestor with absolute certainty simply because your DNA resembles that of a modern population. A genetic connection to a population is not the same as a certificate saying, "This exact person was your ancestor." DNA deals with probability, population genetics, and patterns of inherited variation. It can point toward regions and populations. It can strengthen or weaken family stories, but it cannot automatically provide names, dates, addresses, or complete family trees. And yet, compared with the information Goldberg had before the test, this was extraordinary. The family story had been uncertain. The DNA gave it direction. But the African ancestry wasn't the only major discovery. The results also revealed European ancestry. And that discovery carried a much darker historical context. European ancestry is widespread among African Americans. For some families, it comes from relationships between free people over the generations. But during slavery, genetic mixing also occurred under profoundly unequal and often violent circumstances. Enslaved women had no meaningful legal power to refuse sexual access by enslavers or other white men. Children born to enslaved mothers inherited their mother's enslaved status. So European ancestry found in African American DNA can sometimes be a biological record of coercion and sexual violence under slavery. DNA can tell us that two populations became genetically connected. It cannot tell us the circumstances of every individual relationship. It cannot tell us whether a particular connection came from love, coercion, assault, or something else. And that is one of the most important limitations of genetic ancestry testing. The science can reveal the connection. History has to explain it. In Goldberg's case, the European ancestry could be measured, but the test could not simply hand her the names of the European ancestors responsible. There was no automatic surname, no guaranteed plantation record, no single document connecting a percentage on a genetic report to one specific individual. The DNA revealed part of the history, but much of the history remained hidden. There was another family story that the DNA could examine: Native American ancestry. Like many African American families, Goldberg had heard the possibility that Native American ancestry might exist somewhere in her family tree. But the genetic results did not show significant Native American ancestry. That might sound like a simple yes or no answer, but it reveals something larger. Stories of Native American ancestry have appeared in many African American families for generations. Sometimes those stories may have been connected to real historical interactions. Free black communities and Native American communities did live near each other in parts of the United States, and genuine mixing did occur. But family stories can also develop from physical appearance, a particular skin tone, a certain facial structure, a different hair texture. A family member may have looked different from everyone else, and an explanation was created. Over generations, that explanation can become tradition. In Goldberg's case, the DNA did not confirm the Native American connection. Instead, it strengthened the picture pointing toward African ancestry. But the most remarkable part of the story may have been hidden even deeper, inside her mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is passed from mother to child. That makes it especially useful for tracing a direct maternal line. Mother to daughter, mother to son, then from that mother to the next generation, and from that generation to the next. It creates a genetic thread that can reach much further back than most written records. Goldberg's maternal lineage pointed back to West and Central Africa. But that story doesn't stop with the era of slavery. It reaches much further into the ancient population history of Africa. Thousands of years before European ships crossed the Atlantic. Thousands of years before the United States existed. Thousands of years before modern borders divided Africa into the countries we recognize today. Her maternal lineage connected her to an ancient African genetic history that predates modern nations, modern political boundaries, and even many of the civilizations we learn about in school. And that creates a remarkable perspective. Africa wasn't simply the place where some of Goldberg's ancestors lived before being transported across the Atlantic. It was part of a much older human story, a story that reaches back to the origins of our species. But here's where the story becomes more complicated. You might expect a discovery like this to completely change someone's identity. It didn't. Goldberg didn't suddenly become a different person because of a DNA test. She didn't wake up with a new personality. She didn't erase the identity she had built over decades. Instead, the results seem to have done something much simpler. They filled in a blank space. For years there had been uncertainty. Now there was evidence. And that distinction is incredibly important, because DNA can tell you where some of your ancestors came from, but it cannot tell you who you are. Genetic ancestry is not the same thing as cultural identity. Goldberg's DNA can connect her to the Papel, Bijago, and other West and Central African populations, but she didn't grow up speaking their languages. She didn't grow up inside their communities. She didn't inherit all of their traditions. The genetic connection is real, but it is not the same thing as lived cultural experience, and perhaps that is the most powerful lesson in this entire story. For centuries, slavery attempted to destroy the connections between African families, and their past families were separated. Names disappeared, records were incomplete, stories became fragmented, but history couldn't erase everything. Some of it survived in family memories, some survived in fragments of documents, and some survived inside DNA. Whoopi Goldberg's surname was chosen. Her career was built by her public identity was shaped by her own decisions, but the genetic history beneath that identity existed long before she was born. The DNA couldn't recover every ancestor, it couldn't tell her the names of every person who came before her, it couldn't reconstruct every moment that connected one generation to the next, but it could move the boundary of what was knowable. The Caribbean story gave way to something far more specific and far more complicated. West Africa, Central Africa, European ancestry shaped by a painful history, and a maternal lineage reaching thousands of years into Africa's ancient past. In the end, the DNA didn't give Whoopi Goldberg a completely new identity. It gave her something different: context. It showed that the blank space in her family history was never truly empty. There had always been a story there. It had simply been hidden by time, slavery, migration, and missing records. And perhaps that is the most extraordinary part. The name on the screen was chosen. The career was built. The identity was shaped. But the bloodline had been writing its own story for thousands of years. And for the first time, Whoopi Goldberg was able to see a small part of it.